The man who did as much as anyone to invent modern America was also the first to popularize science in the United States. Turning from industrial manufacturing to producing innovations for the home, Edison originated the mass production of consumer products. His labor-saving devices changed the way people worked, traveled, communicated, studied, and entertained themselves. No wonder that by the time of the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago, the majority of visitors filling out questionnaires asking which American would be best remembered a century later answered Thomas Edison. At that 1893 fair celebrating the 4 centuries of change since Christopher Columbus's first landing in the New World, the Collis engine was as obsolete as the steam power it generated. So, too, the innovations of 1876 had become commonplace in American urban life. Everything on the vast fairgrounds was powered by Edison's electrical inventions, including 5,000 arc street lamps and 100,000 incandescent bulbs. Edison, more than anyone else, had prompted the U.S. Commissioner of Patents to proclaim that America has become known the world around as the home of invention. Paul Israel, who edited Edison's papers, said, "We think of the act of invention as this eureka moment, aha. The light bulb goes off, we have this great idea. That's invention." But for Edison that was the starting point. 'Cause he didn't just have ideas and build devices that worked in the laboratory, he actually took them into the marketplace. And he did it over and over again. He came up with the modern process of innovation. Thomas Alva Edison was born on February 11, 1847, in Milan, Ohio, the seventh and youngest child of Samuel and Nancy Elliott Edison. A powerful myth fabricated by an admiring press depicted Edison as a poor boy like Abraham Lincoln, who lived in a log cabin. In fact, Edison's father was a successful entrepreneur. The Edisons came from old colonial stock, but for generations, they had been dissenters, outsiders, and mavericks. Thomas Edison's great-grandfather, John, was a so-called loyalist, taking the British side in the American Revolution. He left his substantial farm in Caldwell, New Jersey, in 1776, to cross the British lines and act as a guide when British commander Sir William Howe invaded New Jersey. Captured by the revolutionaries and condemned to death for treason, he was held in chains in the Morristown jail for a year before being exchanged for a British prisoner. His property was confiscated, and he had to migrate to Nova Scotia at war's end. His son, Samuel Sr., the inventor's grandfather, grew up in Ontario. The family had migrated there in 1811 after John Edison received a land grant for his services to the British Crown during the American Revolution. John's grandson, Samuel Jr., became a Canadian militia captain who fought against the Americans in the War of 1812. By 1837, however, young Sam was eager to join a revolt against the British, secretly forming a revolutionary militia for the Mackenzie Uprising against the Crown. The plot was discovered, and Edison had to flee, pursued for 3 days by British redcoats, Indians, and dogs. He eventually found refuge in Huron, Ohio. His wife, Nancy, later escaped from Canada with their children, and the family moved to the new canal town of Milan. There Samuel Edison established a successful business manufacturing wood shingles and selling lumber and grain. But the family's fortunes were shattered when the Grand Trunk Railroad bypassed Milan and 80% of the population left. A child apart. 2 of the Edison children had died by the time Nancy gave birth to their 7th child, a small boy with a large head. Thomas Alva, they called him Oral, and he was frequently in trouble for his curiosity. When he was 6, his father whipped him in the town square for setting a little fire inside his father's barn, just to see what it would do. The flames spread rapidly, burning the barn to the ground. With a high wind blowing, the whole town had been endangered, so none of the neighbors invited to watch the public flogging tried to stop it. Edison could still remember that incident vividly 60 years later when writing his memoirs. If he resented his father for humiliating him in public, he never said so. But he never said anything flattering about his father either, and he only rarely mentioned the man. "My father thought I was stupid," he said years later, "and I almost decided I must be a dunce." His was a lonely childhood, his Edison siblings being much older, and Alva often played by himself. Even more than most children, he asked a lot of what his father called foolish questions, usually directing his inquiries to his mother. When he asked her why their goose squatted on its eggs, his mother patiently explained the hatching process, after which Alvar disappeared. We missed him and called for him everywhere, his brother Marion attested. His father found him in a neighbor's barn curled up in a nest he had made filled with goose and chicken eggs. He was trying to hatch them. Alvar also liked to draw, and at age 5, he sketched pictures of some of the signs in Milan. In later years, he would sketch all of his inventions. By the time he was 7, the town had begun its swift, steady decline. The Edisons had to move again, this time to Port Huron, Michigan, at the head of the St. Clair River, where Samuel Edison used what he had made from selling his house and granary to set up another lumber, grain, and feed store. There was rarely any money beyond the rent needed for a house. As for Alvar's schooling, the record is murky. At about this time, he apparently came down with a serious case of scarlet fever, which damaged his hearing. Recurring ear problems would increasingly leave Edison in a silent world. When his parents finally sent him to school at age 8, his teacher, a Puritan clergyman who reinforced his lessons with a leather belt, decided that young Edison was adult. Little was known about hearing loss or physical handicaps at the time, and Edison's memory of his brief, formal education was painful. I used never to be able to get along at school. I was always at the foot of the class. I used to feel that the teachers did not sympathize with me. When Edison overheard the schoolmaster describing him as adult, he ran home and refused to return. His mother, who had taught school in Canada, decided to teach him at home. The boy's problems aside, what seems clear is that the Edisons could no longer afford to pay Alvar's tuition. Edison's true loves emerge. Nancy Edison taught her son not only reading, writing, and arithmetic but the love and purpose of learning. A fast reader, he devoured world history, William Shakespeare, and Charles Dickens, along with an elementary science book, R.G. Parker's School of Natural Philosophy. The latter was a chance discovery of his mother's that described scientific experiments Alvar could perform at home. This was the first book in science I read, he recalled, the first I could understand. Learning now became a lifelong game for Alvar. At 9, he read and tested every one of Parker's experiments, and when his mother found an old dictionary of science, he discovered a passion for chemistry. Not yet 10 when the science of matter, its reactions and interactions, caught his attention, Alvar gathered jars and bottles in the basement and mixed his own chemicals, marking all of them as poison, which concerned the neighbors. Though his father's disapproval was unabated, Edison affirmed that my mother was the making of me. She understood me, she let me follow my bent. She also overlooked the mess made by chemicals in her son's bedroom and the spills of sulfuric acid on furniture and floors that didn't stop until he secluded himself in the cellar with his batteries and bottles. To his father, though, it was a shame Edison never read any serious literature or learned to spell or play with other boys and girls. Thomas Alva never had any boyhood days, his early amusements were steam engines and mechanical forces. Samuel could not comprehend his son's excitement when he was able to verify experiments made by earlier scientists, in particular when he tried to prove the existence of static electricity after reading Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. He rubbed together the fur of 2 big tomcats, whose tails he connected to wires. No sparks flew, but the boy was badly clawed for his efforts. Samuel was savvy enough to exploit the arrival of the telegraph line in Port Huron, making sure his son had a telegraph set and was learning Morse code. Here was a trade that even a hard-of-hearing boy could learn. Able to hear and feel the clicking of the telegraph key, pretty soon he was stringing his own homemade telegraph line to a neighbor's house. By the time the Grand Trunk Line was being completed from Detroit to Port Huron in 1859, the elder Edison was ready to put his 12-year-old son to work on it. He learned that a full-time newsboy would be needed on the train, a job with no wages but one that could be profitable if the boy sold newspapers and food. What passed for the formal education of Thomas Edison had come to an end. He began to ride the rails, sleeping in the baggage car and hawking newspapers, apples, sandwiches, molasses, and peanuts. His earnings went to help his family. Being poor, Edison later recalled, I already knew that money is a valuable thing. Edison used a corner of the seldom-filled baggage car to conduct his chemical experiments, a pursuit that upset the conductor when passengers complained of the frequent odors that wafted through the cars. One day, the jolting of the train dislodged the cork from a bottle of phosphorus, which then dropped to the floor and smashed. The phosphorus burst into flames, and the conductor arrived on the scene to find Edison frantically stamping out the fire. The conductor threw first the chemist and then his laboratory off the train. Edison loved to explore Detroit. The happiest time of my life was when I was 12, he wrote. I was just old enough to have a good time in the world but not old enough to understand any of its problems. Too young to fight when the Civil War broke out in 1861, he nevertheless observed that his newspaper sales jumped when there was a battle. One day in April 1862, the first accounts of a great battle at Shiloh reached the office of the Detroit Free Press by telegraph. Having made it his practice to go to the composing room to see the day's headlines so as to estimate his need for papers, he learned of the fighting. Here was a chance for enormous sales, Edison realized, if only the people along the line could know what happened. Suddenly, he had an idea. Rushing off to the telegraph operator, he offered the man newspaper and magazine subscriptions in exchange for a short bulletin to be wired to train stations and chalked up on bulletin boards along the route telling of the great battle. Then he talked the Free Press managing editor into letting him have 1,000 copies of the paper. Edison and an assistant lugged the papers to the station. Gradually, he raised the price of his papers from 10 to 15 cents at early stops, and at Port Huron, where a large crowd had gathered, Edison yelled, 25 cents, gentlemen, I haven't enough to go around. Quote. It was then it struck him, he said, that the telegraph was just about the best thing going. I determined at once to be a telegrapher. With a clear profit of $150, several $1,000 in 2 days' money, from the extra, Edison also decided to start his own newspaper. He purchased a small second-hand printing press and 300 pounds of old type. He learned to set type and print a small paper, the Port Huron Weekly Herald. It may have been the world's first newspaper printed on a train. The print shop replaced his laboratory in the corner of the baggage car, and Edison switched to recording the births of station agents' children and the names of Union Army recruits, sandwiched between lofty philosophical editorials. In search of livelier material, Edison soon turned the paper into a gossip rag called Paul Pry. Problems sprang up almost immediately. Edison was a terrible speller, and some of his society tidbits were a bit too revealing. One irate subject tracked the publisher down and threw him into the St. Clair River. Serendipity to the rescue. That was the end of Edison's newspaper career, but a new opportunity presented itself when he saw the 3-year-old son of the station master in Mount Clemens, Michigan, playing on the main track in the path of an oncoming locomotive. Edison dashed toward the child and snatched him up. The grateful father rewarded the 15-year-old boy by offering to teach him how to operate a telegraph. He also invited Edison to board free and take meals at his house for 3 months while he studied under the night telegrapher. Showing up for his first lesson with a set of telegraph instruments he had fashioned at a gunsmith's shop, Edison learned a new and respectable craft. For the next 2 years, he wandered all over the eastern United States as a tramp telegrapher, a member of a dapper, carefree brotherhood. He was acutely conscious of his hearing loss. But Edison found that his growing deafness gave him an edge when in a telegraph office, he later recalled, I could hear only the instrument directly on the table at which I sat, and unlike the other operators I was not bothered by other instruments. This ability to find the bright spot in adversity would be a hallmark throughout his career. Neil Baldwin, one of Edison's biographers, said this condition made him feel like he could think more and he could concentrate more. He became very introspective. He often felt like he was alone even when there were other people around. He worked the night shift, a lifelong preference that left his days free for reading scientific and technical books. Edison once compared sleep to a drug, saying that taking too much at a time makes you dopey. You lose time and opportunities. He slept and ate little. He spent most of his pay on books, chemicals, and metal for the experiments he conducted in a succession of rented upstairs back rooms in rundown boarding houses from Memphis to Boston. To gain more time to read, he invented labor-saving processes and telegraphic devices. He was often fired for ignoring office discipline and letting messages pile up while he worked on his experiments. Many of his inventions over the following 20 years could be traced to his attempts to develop equipment that worked faster and saved money. After another inventor, Joseph Stearns, came up with a duplex machine that could send two messages in opposite directions at once, Edison invented a major improvement on the technique, and then he saw a way to double the efficiency by sending two simultaneous messages in each direction over the same wire. He began a long quest that ultimately produced the quadruplex transmitter. He also learned to take down newspaper stories over the wire at great speed, which landed him a job at Boston's main Western Union office in 1868 at age 21, this despite his long hair, baggy pants, plug of chewing tobacco, and hearing difficulties. The last problem he overcame by mastering a skill common among hearing impaired people called filling the gaps, or guessing. This was a natural progression. Telegraph operators routinely used guesswork to fill out interrupted or incomplete messages. Edison was assigned to the top priority New York wire to receive stories for a Boston newspaper. With his wages, he bought more books, including Michael Faraday's two-volume Experimental Researches in Electricity. Like Edison, Faraday was born poor and was self-taught. Edison admired Faraday's selflessness in devoting himself to science without concern for money or titles. Here was a role model to emulate. To his roommate, he announced his intentions: "I am now 21. I may live to be 50. Can I get as much done as he did? I have got so much to do, and life is so short. I am going to hustle." Edison nearly electrocuted himself with a large induction coil intended to be part of his planned multiple message telegraph. But after his improvement on the duplex transmitter, the June 1868 Journal of the Telegraph carried the announcement of it, a mode of transmission both ways on a single wire, which is interesting, simple, and ingenious. A firm believer in self-promotion, the 21-year-old inventor had written the piece himself, signing his roommate's name. Edison then sent copies to telegraphers around the country who had mocked his boarding house experiments. Attracting capital with which to continue his experiments, he quit his job in January 1869 to become a full-time inventor. With a $500 advance, he set to work to improve his double transmitter, offering the devices for sale at $400 each. He lacked the money needed to patent the duplex, but he found an investor to back his next new device, the telegraphic vote recording machine, making it his first patented invention. Edison demonstrated this forerunner of the modern voting machine before the Massachusetts legislature and a committee of the U.S. Congress. It was met with yawns from the politicians, who didn't want to speed up voting and thereby lose an opportunity to make speeches. Chagrined, Edison returned from Washington, vowing henceforth to invent only products that had a sure commercial demand. Developing a forerunner of the stock ticker, a gold price indicator that transmitted numbers as electronic impulses, he took the machine to New York City only to find that Samuel S. Laws had invented something similar and had grown wealthy using it for several years on the New York Gold Exchange. But Laws, sensing a kindred spirit, allowed Edison to sleep on a cot in the basement of the exchange so he could spend his days studying the technology in the main telegraph room. Edison was there when the central telegraph device broke down completely. Under the anxious scrutiny of Laws, his men, and 300 messengers sent by angry dealers all over Wall Street, Edison fixed the complicated machine. Laws hired him the next day, putting him in charge of maintenance. Edison was soon promoted to general manager at the then handsome salary of $300 a month. That same year, 1869, Edison launched a partnership with F. Pope and J.A. Ashley. The principals of Pope, Edison and Company described themselves as electrical engineers, thus coining a new professional term and offering to design instruments and fire alarms, test materials, build telegraph lines, and make experimental apparatus. Edison had devoted the early 1870s to improving telegraphy, and by 1874 he had accomplished his long-time goal of perfecting the quadruplex, making telegraphy far more efficient and profitable. Instead of two messages passing on a single wire now, 4 could be transmitted. Western Union and its competitors didn't have to string as many wires and could lease excess capacity for private lines. The quadruplex would be used well into the 20th century, and Edison's reputation as an inventor skyrocketed. Eventually, Edison made so many improvements to the stock ticker equipment that he and his partners were bought out by the Gold and Stock Telegraph Company. As Edison's reputation began to soar, his personal life was undergoing great change. In 1871, his mother died, the woman who, in his words, was always so true, so sure of me, who made him feel that he had someone to live for, someone I must not disappoint. Then, on Christmas Day, he married Mary Stilwell, a former employee with little experience of the world and a limited understanding of her husband's work and its importance. Though Edison loved Mary, whom he called Popsy Wopsy, his intense involvement with his work weighed on their relationship. Edison often slept in his lab and spent a good deal of his waking moments with his male associates. Nevertheless, the Edisons celebrated the birth of their first son, Marion, in February 1873. Less than 3 years later, Thomas Jr. made his appearance, allowing the boy's father to nickname his sons Dot and Dash. A third boy, William Leslie, was born in October 1878. With his share of the $40,000 paid for the stock ticker business, Edison set up the world's first commercial research laboratory. He called it an invention factory, and staffed it with 50 skilled technicians under his constant supervision. In the spring of 1876, he hired his father to oversee construction of a laboratory complex at Menlo Park, New Jersey, in the hills 25 miles south of Newark. With financial backing from Western Union, Edison pioneered systematic research on the eve of the Centennial Exposition in nearby Philadelphia. Today, Edison's approach is seen as obvious, but it was a sea change and a break with the past. Harvard historian Nancy Cohen said, "This was astoundingly revolutionary. You know, I want to invent. I'm going to be about invention. And I don't really want to be bothered lots of times with very much else. No such thing as failures." Shortly after Alexander Graham Bell patented the telephone in 1876, Edison perfected a superior transmitter that made a speaker's voice louder and clearer over the telephone. It would be used for 100 years. That same year, he experimented with recording and playing back messages sent over the telegraph and the telephone, an effort that ended in the invention of the phonograph, his most original scientific breakthrough thus far in an invention that dazzled the world. Here was an ordinary-looking, fellow-next-door type who had somehow captured speech and bottled it. Indeed, part of Edison's charm was his "oh-shucks" approach to invention. Historian John Staudenmeier said, "He had immense self-confidence, he had a sense of humor, and he would pull things out of the air that people weren't thinking about when he asked a question, and he'd answer it in a way that, wow, I never thought of that." To record messages, Edison needed a way to trap sound waves, invisible and seemingly intangible vibrations passing through the air. So he attached a needle to a diaphragm, a metal disc that vibrated in response to the sound waves. The needle rested against a rotating cylinder wrapped in tinfoil. When the disc vibrated, the needle made an impression in the foil. To reproduce the sound, a second needle was connected to a diaphragm mounted at the base of a funnel-like horn. The second needle followed the grooves in the foil, repeating the vibrations of the recording needle. In December 1877, Edison demonstrated his phonograph to the editors of the prestigious Scientific American magazine. He showed it to President Rutherford B. Hayes the following spring. So magical did the device seem that Edison was hailed by the press as the Wizard of Menlo Park. In 1878, Edison began research on electric lighting to replace gas lights. Gas was a hugely profitable, worldwide industry in the 19th century, lighting city streets as well as factories, businesses, and houses. But it was also dangerous. The lethal fuel could poison people who breathed its fumes and was a source of deadly fires. Edison saw a chance to make a fortune while making cities safer. Experiments in electrical lighting had been done over the preceding 4 decades in England and the United States, but Edison's improvements, especially his use of a filament derived from slightly burned carbon, made the incandescent light bulb cheap and practical for production. He experimented with 6,000 different fibers before settling on the carbon filament. When an assistant mentioned all the failures, Edison replied, "No, they're not failures. They taught something that I didn't know. They taught me what direction to move in." The great inventor then turned to the complex problem of finding a central power source for his lights and other electrified apparatus. In many respects, this was as significant as his invention of the light bulb. It wasn't just coming up with an idea, he knew that even after the light bulb existed, it would be useless without the demand to support it. It would be his vote recorder all over again. From the beginning, Edison knew that inventions that didn't make money were their own kind of failure. We remember famously the light bulb, historian Lisa Gitelman noted. But, of course, you've got to screw the light bulb into a socket, the socket has to be wired, the system has to be metered, there has to be a generator. It's really a massively complex system to put in place to get that light bulb to go off. I mean, I don't think he, going in, realized how complicated it was. By 1882, with the financial backing of J.P. Morgan, Edison's generating and distribution system was put to work in New York City, capping an immense engineering achievement. Edison built the Pearl Street Power Station, a steam-driven electric power plant near Wall Street. Initially, it had just 82 customers, with 400 lamps burning. 2 years later, there were 508 customers and more than 10,000 bulbs. The station also sold steam to nearby factories and heated neighborhood buildings. Over the next decade, Edison expanded his operations and moved to a new research complex in West Orange, New Jersey, that was 10 times the size of Menlo Park. It would be his home for the rest of his long life. Ahead of his time. Often working all night and sequestered in his laboratory for months on end, Edison developed the equipment needed to generate electricity on a large scale: generators, power cables, junction boxes, electric lamps, switches, relays, and more. Spawning a series of companies to make his products, he gradually combined them into the General Electric Company, with manufacturing centered at Schenectady, New York. Not until then was Edison, at 45, free of financial worry. The public, though fascinated, was at first somewhat fearful of Edison's electric lighting. While working out the kinks in the system, people and animals had been electrocuted. So, to ease people's fears and spur demand for his system, Edison created a publicity campaign worthy of P.T. Barnum, or of any modern-day advertising agency. He hired a tap dancer to dance across an electrified floor, the fellow's helmet lighting up in sync with his feet. And he had hundreds of men wearing light bulbs on their heads march through city streets, the bulbs powered by a steam generator rolling nearby. Silly though it may seem to 21st century observers, wearing a bulb on one's head was taken to prove the safety of the electric light. Despite Edison's triumph in creating the earliest electrical grids, he also wound up on the wrong side of technology, a rarity for him, during the famous War of the Currents. That battle was waged in the late 1880s, as an ever-growing number of American communities were becoming electrified. Edison's system, built on direct current, was being threatened by a rival system using alternating current that was being sold by George Westinghouse, the Pittsburgh entrepreneur who had invented the railway air brake. At the time, the AC system was superior because it was more efficient and allowed power to be distributed over longer distances, so the generator could be farther away from a town center and serve a wider array of customers. Westinghouse sales rose, and General Electric stumbled, but Edison refused to concede or to adopt the rival system. One theory is that the math needed to make an AC system work was beyond Edison's grasp. Given all his accomplishments, that claim may seem unlikely. But after all, he was self-educated, and he may well not have gotten that far on his own. Unable to win the war of facts, of science, Edison turned to a smear campaign, maligning his rivals with claims of horrific dangers of electrocution and trying to make Westinghouse the poster child for the adoption of the electric chair. It didn't work. Eventually, Edison's investors would push him out and merge with a separate AC generator. Edison was furious, stubborn in his refusal to accept that in the long run, he had backed the wrong technology. If you make the coalition, my usefulness as an inventor is gone, Edison warned. I can only invent under powerful incentive. No competition means no invention. The fight cost Edison his relationship with General Electric, but he downplayed the loss, proclaiming that his work in electricity had run its natural course. I'm going to do something now so different and so much bigger than anything I've ever done before, he said, that people will forget that my name was ever connected with anything electrical. His workshop, such as it was, moved to a remote community, Ogdensburg, in northwest New Jersey, as Edison and a team of engineers worked to develop a system to extract iron from low-grade ore. The need was dire. The United States was quickly becoming a nation that ran on iron and steel, and decades of mining had plundered the richest veins. The idea was pure Edison in its sheer scale. First, the mountains would be dynamited, and then the rock would be pulverized and ground up to a fine powder. It would be passed through a powerful magnet which would draw the iron out. Edison would spend nearly a decade in Ogdensburg, using close to $2 million on research and design as he and his team wrestled with the various technologies needed to make the production system work. As with the light bulb, it wasn't just one part or product, but a series of interlinked parts that worked as a whole. It was a grimy, dusty workshop, and by all accounts, Edison loved it. The idea was a serendipitous failure. As Edison was perfecting his technology, a huge reserve of rich iron ore was discovered in northern Minnesota. In an instant, the commercial viability of the Ogdensburg project vanished. Told that he had wasted years and millions with little to show but some holes in the ground, Edison's response revealed his optimism and his love of invention. Yeah, but we sure had fun doing it. And then, true to form, he plucked success from the jaws of failure, adapting his iron ore technology to the manufacture of cement and salvaging much of his investment. Once again, he accepted that the marketplace was ultimately the decider of which inventions were good, and then made the marketplace work to his advantage. As Nancy Cohen noted, there's something very interesting about how he literally lets go of what most of the people around him would call failure. And then moves forward without a huge amount of reflection, soul searching. He's thinking, he's seeing, he's observing, he's filing, but he's moving. This was a man who really didn't spend a lot of time looking backward. In a change of direction for American manufacturing, the goods and services Edison produced were aimed at the consumer, not at other businesses. He was so far ahead of his time that his ideas often outstripped available technology and practical applications. For example, he discovered radiotelegraph sound waves 20 years before the radio receiver was invented. The phonograph was Edison's favorite invention, and when others learned how to make practical phonograph records in place of his tinfoil cylinders, he bought them out, making another fortune in the record business. A wager by California railway tycoon Leland Stanford ultimately launched the motion picture, and Edison's involvement in it. Stanford bet $25,000 that a horse in full gallop would have all 4 feet off the ground at a certain moment. In 1878, British photographer Edward Muybridge set up 24 still cameras with wires that were tripped by the horse as it passed, proving Stanford right. 10 years later, Muybridge had the bright idea of interesting Edison in motion photography, proposing that it could boost sales of his phonograph. Edison turned down Muybridge's invention, the zoopraxiscope, but he instructed his assistants to pursue the concept of moving pictures. Later in 1888, Edison announced that he was experimenting upon an instrument which does for the eye what the phonograph does for the ear, which is the recording and reproduction of things in motion. His assistants at the West Orange lab, most notably William K. Dickson, had produced the Kinetograph, a peephole motion picture viewer. When George Eastman began to manufacture his transparent and flexible celluloid film in 1889, Edison could buy a 50-foot strip of film for $2.50. That's it, said an excited Edison when he was shown the long film strip. We've got it. Now work like hell. Having already patented a rapid-fire shutter, Edison assigned Dickson to figure out how to move film through the camera. His solution was to punch holes along the film's edges so a sprocket could synchronize each frame with the movement of the lens shutter. The first films ran horizontally through the movie camera like the modern still camera. On October 6, 1889, Dickson gave a dramatic demonstration to Edison after he returned from a trip to Paris. Dickson, appearing on a screen, bowed and said, "Good morning, Mr. Edison. Glad to see you're back. I hope you are satisfied with the Kinetophonograph," Dickson's name for the camera. Talking motion pictures made their debut that day, but the first public demonstration was not until April 1894 in a penny arcade at 1155 Broadway in New York City. Crowds poured pennies into Edison's arcade peep shows, one person watching at a time. Yet he did not immediately take the next step of projecting the image onto a screen for a mass audience. Only after Thomas Armott created the enabling mechanism for the modern movie projector did Edison buy it and begin cornering the patents and producing the machines that gave his company a virtual monopoly on filmmaking in America for many years. By the mid-1890s, Edison had invested $637.67 to build a tiny studio on the back lot at West Orange. Known as the Black Maria for its resemblance to a police wagon, it was an ugly, oblong building that revolved on tracks to follow the sun. Inside, Annie Oakley shot clay pigeons, Buffalo Bill fired his rifle, and Sioux Indians did their ghost dance before a one-ton camera that looked like an upright piano. Wrong-headed and miserly. For all his genius and talent for innovation, Edison could be incredibly wrong-headed and miserly. He had cornered the patents on the technology of movie making, but he was too frugal to spend an additional $150 to file international patents for it. It isn't worth it, he said. He was often a tyrannical boss who drove his employees hard. He was brutally competitive, dismissing the inventions of others as unimportant, unwilling to recognize their improvements to the whole. Biographer Neil Baldwin pointed out that Thomas Edison had a highly cultivated sense of betrayal, and either you were with him or you weren't. It was quite black and white in that regard. Thomas Edison made science popular and the scientist virtually a cult hero in early 20th century America, but his personal life was less successful. Days, months, and years spent inventing continued to spell neglect for his family. His most productive work years coincided with his first marriage to Mary Stilwell, who died in 1884, possibly of a brain tumor, leaving 3 children their father hardly knew. After Mary's death, he chose to court the 18-year-old socialite, Mina Miller. Edison tapped out his marriage proposal to her in the palm of her hand using Morse code. The couple married in 1886. 3 more children, Madeline, Charles, and Theodore, followed. Mina was a great beauty who, fortunately, had her own charitable and social activities, especially since her husband and 2 of his closest friends, Henry Ford and Harvey Firestone, liked nothing better than to drive into the woods, live under canvas tents, tell tall stories, and dress up like cowboys. Although Edison achieved fame and grew wealthy, he was not especially impressed with his own genius. Genius, he was fond of saying, is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. He died at the age of 84 after a life of hard work that led him to amass an astounding 1,093 patents. On the night of his funeral, President Hoover requested that the lights at the White House and in homes and businesses all across the United States be dimmed in honor of the man who had almost single-handedly invented modern life. At his funeral service, his life was summed up in a tribute written by an old associate, Arthur J. Palmer. He has led no armies into battle. He has conquered no countries, and he enslaved no peoples. Yet he wields a power the magnitude of which no warrior ever dreamed. He commands a devotion more sweeping in scope, more worldwide than any other living man, a devotion rooted in deep human gratitude, and untinged by bias or race, color, religion or politics. This democratic, kindly, modest being has bestowed upon the human race blessings instead of bondage, service instead of serfdom, construction instead of conquest. Possessed of an immeasurable breadth of vision, his world aspect comprehends peoples rather than people, masses rather than men, that great restless surging tide of creatures, that mighty human glacier pressing irresistibly toward an ever-widening horizon of civilization. In the passionate pursuit of material truths and their conversion into practical, usable beneficent forms, civilization has never seen his equal. And of this great man, this super being, who defies classification, what more can be said, what greater tribute than this? He is humanity's friend. Thomas Alva Edison was laid to rest in a simple grave under a great oak tree at Rosedale Cemetery in West Orange, on the 52nd anniversary of his perfection of the incandescent bulb. Lessons. Edison was surely history's most prolific inventor, a mind so far unequaled in making fundamental breakthroughs. But even if we can't hope to match his achievements, we can learn from his example. March to your own drum. Berated for asking foolish questions, and openly derided by his father and teachers as stupid, a dunce, or adult, this lonely boy was further isolated by his deafness. But he was undiscouraged, a lifelong optimist whose lively curiosity helped him find the answers to questions no one else even asked. A man who walked by himself, Edison slept as little as possible, dressed indifferently, wasn't interested in what he ate, and saw work as his recreation. But the downside of his genius was that he could be a tyrannical boss, neglect his family, and hold his own course to the point of obstinacy. In The Current Wars, with George Westinghouse, Edison stubbornly refused to concede the superiority of alternating current over his own preferred direct current and had to drop out of the flourishing new industry he had founded. Chart your course and stick to it. But try to relate to others, and resist hubris. You won't always be right, and it won't hurt you to admit it.
Learn to love learning.
Once Edison's mother began homeschooling him, his unusual intelligence became apparent. He devoured reading, writing, and arithmetic as well as an elementary science textbook. Most important, Nancy Edison worked to instill in her son the love and purpose of learning, and her success was stunning. Edison was a learner all his life. When he had jobs, he preferred to work the night shift to free up his days for reading, as well as to make time for more reading in the hours when work slowed to a trickle. Most of his wages went to buy books and chemicals for his experiments. Even in his later years, long after he was hailed as the Wizard of Menlo Park, Edison was launching into new fields and soaking up new learning. Never lose your curiosity and never stop learning. You can never know too much. Recognize opportunity and grab it. Selling newspapers and snacks to passengers on a train in Michigan, Edison made his first big profit by seizing the chance to sell many more papers with news of the Battle of Shiloh. When his chemical experiments in the baggage car caused a fire that got his laboratory thrown off the train, he began publishing his own newspaper for passengers and railroad employees. It isn't enough just to be in the right place at the right time, you have to be able to do the right thing. Edison got his training in telegraphy as a reward for rescuing a small boy from an oncoming locomotive. He won a key job in Samuel Losser's gold exchange because, when the complex central telegraph machine broke down and stymied trading, Edison was the only one who knew how to fix it. Edison also made his own new opportunities. His full-time, fully staffed research center, aimed specifically at invention, was a concept new to the world, and he made it a quick success. We can't all be geniuses, but don't hesitate to think outside the box. The fact that no one has ever had this idea may be the very thing that makes it a winner. Turn failure to your advantage. Edison's research on electric lighting involved years of experimentation. He tried 6,000 different fibers before settling on the carbon filament. When one of his assistants mentioned the failures, Edison corrected him, "No, they're not failures. They taught something that I didn't know. They taught me what direction to move in." It was a failure, the fact that his stock ticker had already been invented, that led Edison to his job with Samuel Loss. When his loss in the current was froze him out of the electricity industry, he turned to developing new methods of mining iron ore. And when vast new iron deposits made those techniques irrelevant just as he was perfecting them, he adapted them to the cement business. Great leaders are not infallible. What makes them great is their willingness to accept and rebound from failure. They see it as just part of the process that eventually leads to success. Shine the spotlight on your creations. Edison never shied from calling attention to his inventions. When he achieved his first major invention, improving the duplex telegraph transmitter, he wrote the news article about it himself, signing it with his roommate's name, and sending it off to the friends who had previously laughed at his ideas. Edison knew that to succeed, any invention had to fill a demand and make a profit. He stood ready to do whatever was necessary to achieve those two ends. Most conspicuously, the light bulb would have been useless without big generators, transmission systems, and utilities to distribute electricity, and Edison not only worked tirelessly to develop the equipment, he found backing for such a complex system from no less than J.P. Morgan, the era's leading financier. Before the generating system was perfected, electrocutions had occurred. To ease public fear and create demand, Edison dreamed up a publicity campaign worthy of a modern-day advertising agency. He hired a tap dancer to dance across an electrified floor, his helmet lighting up with every tap of heel auto, an entertaining novelty that was seen as proving the system's safety. Remember, self-promotion isn't a sin. Sometimes it's even necessary to get an idea accepted by a fearful or incredulous public. Great leaders don't hesitate to call attention to their creations. Katharine Graham had to make the call. Should her newspaper, The Washington Post, publish the story of the Nixon administration's secret history of the Vietnam War? A federal court had already forbidden the New York Times from printing any more articles on the subject. Now the Post also had access to the Pentagon Papers, and its writers and editors were hard at work summarizing their contents. But printing them might be illegal. It would surely infuriate the White House. Even if it didn't kill the paper, the Post's reputation would be ruined if the writers got anything wrong. Ben Bradley and Phil Guilin, Graham's trusted editors, were telling her she had to publish. Fritz Beebe, her lawyer and business mentor, was saying no. Graham knew the risks. But when she said just that, Guilin replied, "There's more than one way to destroy a newspaper." That stuck in her mind. Graham was only a fledgling publisher, still learning the business she had inherited after her husband's death. But she had printer's ink in her blood, and she was inspired by the loftiest credo of journalism, to find and tell the truth, come what may. "I took a big gulp," she wrote years later, and said, "Go ahead, go ahead, go ahead. Let's go. Let's publish." In the end, the Supreme Court supported that decision, and the story changed history. It also established the Post as one of the nation's most important newspapers, one that would later play an even more crucial role in the Watergate scandal that ended Richard Nixon's presidency. Graham's courage was justly praised, but that's only one of the many lessons her life holds for leaders everywhere. Kay, as nearly everyone called her, Graham won worldwide acclaim for her backing of Bradley and his two young investigative reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, in their dogged pursuit of the Watergate story. After the scandal forced Nixon to resign in 1974, the Post won a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage. Only a year later, Graham's courage and determination were tested again in a grueling, violent pressmen's strike that went on for 4 interminable months and could have put the paper out of business. And throughout her career, she struggled to overcome her timidity, assert herself in what was still a man's world, and master the techniques of management and leadership that she had never been taught. She was her own fiercest critic. But her story is a classic of triumph over adversity, and her own account of it, her autobiography, personal history, was honest, unsparing, and a bestseller. That was what saved me. She was born Catherine Mayer in New York City on June 16, 1917. Her father, Eugene Mayer, came from a prosperous Jewish family in San Francisco. He moved east as a young man and became one of New York's most successful investment bankers. Mayer cultivated the image of a gambler, but in reality, he never invested in a company without exhaustive research that convinced him he was making a surefire bet. J. Pierpont Morgan said of him, "Watch out for this fellow Mayer, because if you don't, he'll end up having all the money on Wall Street." By 1915, Mayer's fortune matched his age times a million, $40 million, the equivalent of $900 million today. Mayer might have come close to fulfilling Morgan's prophecy, but he saw money as a means to even more satisfying ends. He dissolved his Wall Street firm, moved to Washington, D.C., and got involved in national politics and finance. In 1930, Herbert Hoover appointed him chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Mayer bought up the near-defunct Washington Post in 1933 and set about making it a respected and profitable paper. In 1946, when he was 70, Harry Truman made him the first president of the World Bank. Smart, powerful, and public-spirited, Mayer was a man of many virtues, but fatherhood was not high among them. In his galaxy, his 5 children were distant planets, rarely visited, much less explored. And to them, he was the distant sun, a source of warmth, but a long way off. Kay Graham's mother, Agnes Ernst Mayer, came from an affluent New York family with Methodist roots. She was attractive, clever, driven, a fiercely independent woman whose real interests were the arts and people in the arts. Agnes Mayer regarded childbearing as her duty, but once her 5 children were born, she left them in the nest while flying off by herself. She spent months at a time in Europe, cultivating friendships with prominent artists and writers, including the sculptors Constantin Brancusi and Auguste Rodin, the photographer Edward Steichen, and the novelist Thomas Mann. Wealth and position allowed Agnes Graham to live by her own rules. In personal history, Graham writes that her mother came on so strong you wilted. She recounts her shame and embarrassment when Agnes would march to the front of a line, announce, "I am Mrs. Eugene Mayer of the Washington Post," and demand to be taken first. Soon after Catherine was born, Graham's parents moved to Washington, leaving all 5 children behind in a vast Fifth Avenue apartment. For the first 4 years of her life, Graham and her siblings saw their parents only sporadically, but they were in good hands. Their full-time nanny, Margaret Ellen Powell, was a trained nurse and a much-loved surrogate mother. Powley, as the children called her, took care of them all until they were handed over to a governess, Anna Ott, known as Mademoiselle. When Graham was 4, the children joined their parents in Washington, where she eventually attended Madeira, the exclusive girls' boarding school in McLean, Virginia. Summers were spent at the family's estate in Mount Kisco, New York, with sojourns at their ranch in Wyoming, as well as numerous trips to Europe. It was a life of ease and luxury, but Graham said money was a taboo subject of conversation, along with sex and religion. I didn't know we were rich any more than I knew we were Jewish. She saw herself all through her childhood as ugly, unloved by her mother and distant from her father. But somehow, she said, she sensed that he believed in her, and that was the single most sustaining thing in my life. That was what saved me. Graham said her father was very shy and remote on one level, witty but very distant and unable to be intimate. But Eugene Meyer did understand the potential of his daughter, once telling the Washington socialite Alice Roosevelt Longworth, "You watch my little Kate. She'll surprise you." Stars on the rise. When Katharine Graham's father bought the Washington Post, it was bankrupt and so unpromising that he snapped it up at auction for just $825,000. Among the beneficiaries was young Katharine, who got her first taste of journalism with a summer job as a copygirl. Both her parents were passionately involved with the paper, and from then on, the Post was always near the center of her life. In the fall of 1934, she went to Vassar College and soon discovered that her worldviews needed editing. That happened. Graham entered Vassar as a Republican, like her parents, and left 2 years later as a New Deal Democrat. She transferred to the University of Chicago, where she joined the liberal wing of the American Student Union. After graduating in 1938, she got a job as a cub reporter at the San Francisco News for $24 a week. After a rough start, it took her 3 hours, she recounted, to write her first 2-sentence story. She was assigned to cover labor news, which she did with curiosity, empathy for the workers, and passion. More than a bit of passion, by her own account, Graham's waterfront beat led her into an affair with Pat Patton, a bright, streetwise charmer who headed the Warehousemen's Union. For Graham, this fusion of cultural opposites was good fun if bad journalism, until it dawned on her that Patton had a wife and a serious drinking problem. She saw in hindsight that her behavior was unprofessional. But her apprenticeship in San Francisco had also confirmed her love of journalism itself. Less than a year later, in the spring of 1939, Graham's father lured her back to the Post to edit letters to the editor. Her new job was announced in Time magazine. To Washington, D.C., went comely 21-year-old Catherine Sick Meyer, daughter of publisher Eugene Meyer, to handle for $25 a week the letters to the editor department of her father's Post. Said Father Meyer, "If it doesn't work, we'll get rid of her." One of her San Francisco cronies mailed her the clip with a note, "There are no ifs in California. Come back to us." The Post, launched in 1877, had been the least of Washington's 5 papers when Meyer acquired it, by both financial and journalistic yardsticks. It was still ailing 6 years later, but his credo was that, in the long run, quality will be rewarded. He had slowly improved both the paper's bottom line and its reputation, turning the editorial page into a must-read forum for policy discussions and opinions. Still, it was a costly hobby. Not until after World War II did the Post turn a profit. By then, Meyer had sunk $20 million into it. Soon after her arrival, Graham fell in with a group of bright, wealthy young men who had rented an estate in Arlington, Virginia, called Hockley Hall. Among these rising stars was a recent Harvard Law School graduate and law review editor, Philip Graham. Handsome, smart, and charismatic, he grew up in Florida, where his father made a fortune in farming and real estate. Graham's half-brother, Bob Graham, was later both governor of Florida and a U.S. senator. In Washington, Phil Graham had landed one of the capital's most prestigious entry-level jobs, law clerk for a Supreme Court justice. He had already served 2 justices, first Stanley Forman Reed, then Felix Frankfurter, a court appointee who had previously been one of Phil Graham's law professors at Harvard. Hockley Hall became the center of Graham's social life and a magnet for other gifted young intellectuals, including Frankfurter, Dean Acheson, Archibald MacLeish, and Francis Biddle. Graham recalled the parties and the laughter, but mostly the wide-ranging debates that could go on for days on subjects that ranged from Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal to communism, Nazism, and civil rights. Soon Graham proposed, and she accepted. They were married on June 5, 1940, and moved into a small row house in Georgetown. He continued clerking at the Supreme Court, she kept working at the Post. But this interlude was brief. 6 months later, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor disrupted the Grahams' lives, along with millions of others. Phil Graham enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1942. Kay followed him to postings in South Dakota and Pennsylvania before he was sent to the Pacific as an intelligence officer. Katharine Graham became a mother in 1943 with the birth of Elizabeth Morris Graham, now the writer Lally Weymouth. Kay was the first to acknowledge her uneasiness around small babies, no surprise, given her mother's example. She had 3 more children. Donald was born in 1945, William in 1948, and Stephen in 1952. No job for a woman. In June 1946, Mayer was named to head the World Bank, and Phil Graham became publisher of the Post. The family moved into a large house in Georgetown that became Katharine Graham's principal home for the rest of her life. 2 years later, Mayer sold 5,000 shares of stock to the couple, giving them control of the Post. But it was unequal control. Mayer assigned 3,500 shares to his son-in-law and 1,500 shares to his daughter. As Mayer saw it, no man should be in the position of working for his wife. In her memoir, Graham recalled that curiously I not only concurred but was in complete accord with the idea. She elaborated, I really felt I was put on earth to take care of Phil Graham. He was so glamorous that I was perfectly happy just to clean up after him. I did all the scut work, paid the bills, ran the house, drove the children. I was always the butt of family jokes. You know, good old mum plodding along. And I accepted it. That's the way I viewed myself. Others viewed her much the same way, especially her own mother. Agnes Mayer had taken little interest in Kay as she grew up and had never appreciated the keen intelligence and range of interests that won her acceptance by the Hockley Hall intellectuals. She treated Kay with dismissive near contempt. Once, with the family gathered by the swimming pool, Kay walked up to the chairs where her mother and husband were chatting. Run along, dear, said Agnes. We're having an intellectual discussion. Kay did as she was told. Phil Graham turned out to be a gifted newspaperman, and he shared Mayer's conviction that profit would come from stellar journalism. In 1954, he and his father-in-law bought the competing morning paper, the Times-Herald, shut it down, and moved its popular features and columnists to the Post. Circulation jumped. Phil Graham also purchased the company's first 2 television stations. Increasingly, he was becoming involved as a backstage player in Washington politics. He was committed to racial equality and closely allied to Lyndon Baines Johnson, then Senate Majority Leader, as Johnson fought to pass civil rights legislation. When his friend John F. Kennedy ran for president in 1960, Phil Graham helped persuade him to make Johnson his running mate. But the brilliant publisher had a dark side, well known to his wife. More and more, he became 2 people, one the active public figure, working impossible hours, accomplishing miracles, the other a tormented man who drank too much, behaved erratically, and suffered bouts of severe depression. In 1957, these mood swings triggered a nervous breakdown. One October night, he collapsed in a fit of despair, pain, and weeping. Katharine Graham, terrified, spent hours trying to console him, neither slept all night. In the morning, she sought medical help and eventually got him to a psychiatrist. The diagnosis was manic depression, known now as bipolar disorder. The shock of her husband's collapse was hard on Kay Graham, the aftermath was worse. The couple could not bring themselves to admit his illness. Apart from his doctor, they told no one and relied largely on hope. She spent the next year ministering to him almost full time. They often took refuge at their farm in Virginia, where she was his sole caretaker. Phil Graham battled the disease for more than 6 years. But his condition steadily worsened, and he was twice committed to a psychiatric hospital in Maryland. His drinking grew worse, and he began having affairs, which he made little effort to hide. Nevertheless, the public man was still racking up successes. In 1961, Newsweek magazine, then a lame competitor of Henry Luce's Time, came up for sale. Phil Graham had little interest in it until Ben Bradley, then Newsweek's assistant Washington bureau chief, spent most of a night persuading him of the magazine's potential to become a real national voice. Phil Graham met with Osborne Elliott, Newsweek's 36-year-old managing editor, and their views meshed well. He bought the magazine, somewhat to his wife's dismay. She feared he was already overextended. But Phil Graham saw the magazine as a chance to establish a national presence and prove he wasn't just a son-in-law. And in the next 2 years, with Elliott installed as editor and bringing in a new generation of reporters and writers, Newsweek steadily improved. With Phil Graham's enthusiastic consent, Elliott signaled a new era at Newsweek with a cover story, Thunder on the Right, exposing the John Birch Society and similar extreme right-wing organizations. The magazine's conservative readers cancelled thousands of subscriptions, and many advertisers pulled out. But Graham and Elliott rejoiced at the ruckus. Elliott wrote later, since Newsweek had made itself a magazine to watch. Early in 1963, however, Phil Graham began a romance with a Newsweek researcher. Kay soon found out about the affair, and after that Phil made no attempt to hide it, taking the researcher with him on business trips and asking his friends to accept the situation. Some did, others, loyal to Kay, refused to meet the woman. Finally, Phil took her to a publishing convention, where he had a breakdown so severe that he was brought home in a straitjacket. Furious at having all this played out in public, the publisher announced he was leaving his wife for the researcher. Soon afterward, however, he ended the affair, returned home, and, in June 1963, began his second stay in a mental hospital. On August 3, he was released for the weekend and went to the farm, where his wife found him quite noticeably much better. After lunch on the back porch, they went to their bedroom for a nap. Then, Catherine Graham recalled, Phil got up, saying he wanted to lie down in a separate bedroom he sometimes used. Only a few minutes later, there was the ear-splitting noise of a gun going off indoors.